Good afternoon and welcome to the monthly Central United States Climate Outlook. Just one housekeeping item. Please mute your line using *6 so we may keep the line clear so everyone may hear. Thank you. Our speaker today is Brian Fuchs, climatologist with the National Drought Mitigation Center at the University of Nebraska at Lincoln. Following the briefing, we will open up the lines to take questions. Now let's turn it over to Brian. Brian?
All right, thank you, John, and good afternoon, everyone, or good morning if you're visiting from out in western part of the country. Thank you for joining us today, and again, I'm going to be the host driving us through what's been going on since the last call in January and touching base on quite a few topics today, so I'm going to go through this quite quickly in places, but again, like John said, we will have questions at the end, so if you have something you'd like to ask myself or anyone else in the group, we can take those at the end, and John will moderate those. So again, this is the climate outlook for the Great Plains and Midwest. A neat picture on my first slide here of Chicago digging out, and one of the bigger weather-making events in the region over the last month has been the beginning of February and the snow that came through parts of Nebraska, Iowa, and even into northern Illinois, where I think it was Jim Angel, the state climatologist of Illinois, sent me some information that the snow totals for many parts of the state actually doubled for the season with just that one event, and there were a top 5 event, I think it ended up being for Chicago as far as snow total. So as quiet as the winter has been in the region, we definitely have had some events that have caught notice of those of us in the region. So some general information for these calls. There's a lot of collaboration. Those folks are listed here. The next Outlook webinar is going to be on March 19th with Wendy Ryan from the Colorado State Climate Office being the host of that one. These are also being archived. There's a couple different places to go and grab those, as well as information about future calls. So the agenda that I'm going to speak about today are the current conditions, the regional climate updates, as well as ending with quite a bit of information on the Outlook information that CPC released today. On the same slide here, we're looking at something that's been quite common across the western reaches of the region for much of the winter and even going into last fall, were the temperature records that are being sent. And this is just a snapshot of January and February so far. Each one of those red dots signifies where a maximum temperature for the day had been set. And so you can see it's not been isolated to one part of the state. And we could go up into Wyoming and down to New Mexico and further west and see similar types of records being set. And I thought it was pretty interesting when Wendy Ryan from Colorado sent this out earlier this week, and I wanted to share. So looking at the current conditions, again, this is a neat map that was put together by the Weather Service, looking at that early February snowfall and some of those areas in the Chicago metro area, as well as just to the west of the Quad Cities in Iowa. We had some very good snow totals up to 18 inches with that 2-day event. So again, like I said, we have had some quiet times this winter, but others have really impacted us in a big way. Looking at the last 30 days, so this pretty much picks up from where we had our last webinar, and this is looking at the departure of normal temperature. And this has been a very, very common pattern which we've seen through much of the fall and into the winter. And that has been the further east you go, the eastern reaches, Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, parts of Illinois, and Kentucky. Definitely we've seen below normal temperatures through this time, but as you go west, that gradient increases sharply, and by the time you hit Wyoming and Montana and parts of Colorado, you're looking at departures of 10 or more degrees above normal just over the last 30 days. And how does this turn in tune fit with our climate? The numbers that came out of NCDC for the month of January, we can see that many locations for temperature in the lower left-hand part of the panel are right up there in top 10 warmest Januaries on record. So looking at Wyoming and Colorado, very warm. As you go further west, it's even warmer based on 121 years of records. But then again, as you go to the east, we are seeing that there is this transition, and by the time you get to portions of Ohio and Kentucky, Indiana, those temperatures extremes, at least for last January, we don't see them, and they're actually below normal. Precipitation was also a key during January, quite dry through much of the region. We see many locations. Nebraska, for example, 8th driest on record, Wyoming 10th driest, Wisconsin 12th driest. And we see that most of the other areas, even though they weren't in top 10 or 15 driest Januaries, were quite dry. Moving forward to the precipitation over the last 30 days, I have the percent of normal in the upper right-hand corner and the departure from normal in the lower left. And what we can see is, as we know that winter is typically a drier time of the year, meaning that even though we see some heavy snow totals, those don't equate to a lot of snow water equivalency in general. And so we are seeing that, I want to point out parts of northern Illinois and southern Wisconsin that were impacted by that early February precipitation with the snowfall. And even over the last 30 days, they're still below normal. And you can see the storm track starting from north central Kansas through Iowa and into parts of northwest Illinois that really did pick up a good chunk of precipitation, not only some wet snow, but accumulating snow on a couple different events through that region. But you see a lot of orange and brown colors out there on that map, and we're really seeing that for the most part I would classify the region as a whole quite dry over the last 30 days. Taking that out to the last 90 days, so that's pretty much from mid to late November to present, we see more of that, especially as you look at the eastern reaches of the region, Kentucky, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Missouri, and especially up into parts of North Dakota and Minnesota. The percent of normal in general has been about 50% or less, but you do see some pockets of heavier precipitation. Again, a couple events can really make a difference in those areas that are looking green and blue. And in the lower left for that 90-day precipitation, the departures, even as dry as it's been, we are only seeing departures of maybe an inch and a half for most of the region. Parts of Illinois, Missouri, into Kansas, a little bit more, up to 3 inches for those departures. But then you can really see in Kentucky and portions of western Tennessee, the extreme southeast portions of Missouri, those departures from normal end up kicking up a little bit more as it has been drier in those areas, 6 to 7 inches or more in parts of those regions. And that does include the precipitation from the big snow event that did take place earlier this week. So you take out the 1 to 2 inches of liquid precipitation associated with that event, and you can see that you're approaching some deficits prior to this week that were up there to 8 to 9 inches in some of those areas of Kentucky. So again, we have had a fairly dry winter, but even with the dry winter, those deficits have not accumulated too greatly. And going back to conditions to last fall, most of the state climatologists I've heard from in the region have said that we're not seeing soil moisture issues in the region, that we have a ways to go before we'd see that develop. And from the neighbors out in the west, one of the big impacts they've seen in Colorado and parts of Wyoming has been in the winter recreation realm, where just not have seen the same snows, and even with the warm temperatures, taking some of those lower elevation snows away quite rapidly. So here's where we are from NCDC, the November through January climate, the precipitation rankings up in the upper right and temperatures in the lower left. And again, you can see that east to west gradient in temperatures. As we go further to the west, we see many of the states showing top 10, top 15 rankings. California, warmest on record, and these are beating records from last year that were set. And the further you go east, you do see that coolness in parts of Kentucky and Tennessee and fairly near average in much of the eastern part of the Midwest. If you look at the precipitation rankings, Kentucky really does stand out, top 10 driest for November through January. And again, we saw those deficits on the maps I showed prior. And even in some of the other locations, even though it hasn't been overly dry, it is starting to show up that these time frames are coming in well below average, even for the winter months. So year-to-date precipitation, percent of normal in the upper right, departure from normal in the lower left. Again, we can see those pockets that have picked up on some of the recent precipitation since the first of the year, looking specifically in parts of western Nebraska, up into central North Dakota, Montana, Wyoming. Some of those areas really stand out, as well as into Iowa and Illinois, southeast Nebraska, north central Kansas. Those have been the wettest spots, at least for the calendar year so far. And the dry areas also stand out. And again, I almost look more at the departure from normal in that lower left panel to see those departures of 4 to 5 inches, quite commonplace through the Ohio River Valley area, through southern Missouri into southeast Kansas, north central and northeast Oklahoma during this time frame. Year-to-date temperature just solidifies some of what I've already said. You really see that east to west gradient, and by the time you get out into northwest Colorado and southwest Wyoming, you see for the calendar year 9 to 10 degrees above normal for temperatures through that time frame for the last 6 to 7 weeks. As we transition into some of the hydrology of the region, the 28-day average stream flow product is being shown here with the explanation of the percentiles below. And any of these stream gauges, especially in the more northern climates, we need to take with a grain of salt this time of year, as we can have rapid freeze-up conditions, and that can impact what some of these gauges are showing, and some of them are completely frozen over but still reporting. So again, as you look at those more northern stations, you may want to dig into them a little bit more closely if you see a site that really interests you. But overall, the pattern I wanted to show was as you get into more of the southern and southeastern reaches of the region, through southern Ohio, Indiana, into Kentucky, there are quite a few gauges that are running in the 10th percentile or lower for the last 28-day average, and many of those during that time frame had not been frozen up. So there is some dryness, and that extends all the way into the Appalachians. We also see the lingering long-term dry stream flow readings from south central Kansas all the way into Texas, associated with the multi-year long-term drought conditions, where many of the impacts still remaining are associated with longer-term hydrological low flow readings in those regions. As we go into the northern Rockies and that, we see a lot of the much above normal readings, and again, take those with a grain of salt, as we don't know the conditions of the water flowing. So looking at the Missouri River Basin, we see a lot of those empty circles. Again, that are those gauges that aren't even reporting for this time of year. So mainly focused on what's being shown in Kansas and Missouri on this graphic with some of the low flows, but mixed in there as well with some flows that are normal to above normal. Going into the upper Mississippi, again, after you get out of Illinois, it looks like a lot of those gauges are not reporting, and again, the time of year really dictates that. But as you get into southern Illinois, southern Missouri, you can see that we're running in the 10th to 24th percentile for stream flows over the last 28 days, which does start to stand out. And we get into the Ohio River Valley, and we see how Kentucky, West Virginia, southern Ohio, southern Indiana really start standing out with those low flows on average over the last 28 days, many of those in the 10th percentile or 10th to 24th percentile during that time frame. Snow cover has been something that's been discussed quite a bit, and I've touched on it a little bit already on the call. It seems like we've had several cycles of snow where it's been melted, and then we're left with the barren ground again, and then we'll get some snow. It doesn't seem like we've had a winter where we've had a couple of years ago where the snow just kept accumulating and accumulating through the entire winter, and we ended up with a very wet start to the spring because of all the snow that was melting and the runoff associated with it. So what we're seeing is all those areas in green through the Dakotas, northeast Nebraska, into Kansas and Oklahoma, those are pretty well snow-free at this time, and you can also see some of that up into portions of Montana What we're seeing is the remnants of some of that snow through northern Illinois, and then the recent snow in southern Missouri into Kentucky, with right now 8 to 12 inches of snow on the ground associated with the most recent events. But for the most part, many folks are saying that this has been a year with snowfall being fairly below normal for much of the area. And we look at the snow water associated with that existing snowpack on the ground, and for most areas we're only seeing a couple inches of water at most in those snows. Again, the higher elevations in Wyoming and Colorado do stand out a little bit more, and anywhere from 10 to 16, maybe even 18 inches associated with the snowpack up there. And we'll touch on that a little bit more with some of the information from the SnowTel sites that I have coming up. And so the western snowpack, we look at the Missouri River Basin, and for the most part, the left-hand side of the screen is showing that many of the locations are running in the 70th or better percentile. There's a couple red dots there on the North Platte River Basin in south central Wyoming, but for the most part, snowpack through the Rockies and the Missouri Basin is not doing too bad. Right at normal to slightly below or slightly above for many of the locations. But as you look at the west as a whole, you see as you go west into the Cascades and the Sierras and even down into the southwest, many locations, the red plus signs on that right-hand side of the frame, those are showing that there is absolutely no snowpack at all. And to see the number of those locations through the west is just showing two different things. One, how warm it's been, that the storm events that do take place are not coming as frozen precipitation, but more as rain. And number two, just how many of these locations are snow-free for this time of year, which is quite unheard of for many of these locations. So looking at some individual basins within the states, we're looking at Colorado right away, looking at, for the most part, if you would divide the state and disclude the four corners of San Miguel, Animas, San Juan, and Dolores Basin, and the upper Rio Grande, most of the state isn't doing too bad, anywhere from 72 in the Gunnison to 101% in the South Platte, but it does get lower as you go to the southwest part of the state where they have not seen as much snow. And this is, again, looking at snow water equivalent percent of normal in these different basins. As we go into Wyoming, similar types of conditions. It looks like as you go into the northern part of the state and the western part of the state, most of those areas are above normal, but the Little Snake, upper North Platte, the Laramie, the Cheyenne, most of those are running in the 70s to low 80s as far as the percent of normal for this time of year. We are only mid-February, so there is some time to make up on some of these shortages as we move forward yet. And the last one, Montana, looking at some of the headwaters of the Missouri and where they feed in. Most of those areas are, again, running in the 80s to above 100% during this time, except for those areas in far western Montana. So here's the stream flow forecast that came out as of February 1st from the NRCS, and it does look like that all the green dots on there are showing percent of average being 90 to 109%, and we see the majority of the region in the Missouri River Basin is falling in that range. There are some areas, especially on the North Platte Basin, where we're seeing maybe 50 to 70%, or even maybe a little bit lower as of right now, and also out in portions of Montana where we're seeing some 50 to 70 percentile rankings of the forecast. Again, this came out February 1st, doesn't take into account anything that has happened since then or what will be happening here in the short term as conditions will be changing. Just something to keep track of as these forecasts do come out to get an idea of how much water will be running into these systems. So speaking of the Missouri River Basin system and snowpack, this is looking at the snow water content, again, how much water is stored in that snowpack in the basin. And as you can see above Fort Peck and then Fort Peck to Garrison, if you look at the solid blue compared to the red line average, we're running right on average for this year. And that's been fairly consistent. Started out a little bit slow in both locations, but we have ran fairly close to average since then. And this is information that has come out of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and Kevin Grode sent that my way. I appreciate that. We can also look at the Platte River Basin, looking at the same thing, the snowpack water content. And looking at the total North Platte, you can see that it is trending a little bit below the historical average, and it really has dipped down more in February, mid-January to current, where we're starting to see that loss starting to build. And the total South Platte, again, we saw those numbers running right at 100%. In Colorado, I think it was 101%. And so that's running right along the curve of what's expected. So as we go, again, further into the winter and closer to spring, these curves typically peak about the beginning of April, and then we start seeing the typical decline. So it's something that we have about 40 more days of what we would consider an accumulation period before we start seeing the peaks and where we're at, and that will give us not only a better runoff forecast, but also how much water will be going in to not only the Missouri River Basin system, but also sub-basins such as the Platte. As we move on to the Great Lakes, we talked about in the fall as many of the lakes were right at historical high water marks for that time of year. And if we look at the January mean lake levels on the upper right, we can still see that many of them are running above normal, especially Lake Superior still running quite a bit above the historical average, and many of them are within a foot or two of the historical maximums. So water levels are still quite high on the Great Lakes. Looking at the precipitation down in the lower left for the lakes and for January, and then also the last 12 months, we can see that January was drier. I think the maximum we're showing on here is for Lake Erie, the basin around Lake Erie at 73%, but the 12-month comparisons are all right at mid to upper 90% of average to even above 100%. So again, the winter precipitation is minimal when you start looking at the influx of water into the lakes. But if we do continue to see snow accumulate in some of these basins, it will continue with these high water marks that we have seen over the last 6 to 9 months or so in the Great Lakes. Great Lakes means we're talking about ice and open water. Right now, that ice cover is right at 82% of the lakes being covered, and you can see the open water available on Lake Michigan, and some of the lakes are completely frozen over right now. And that's running within in line of what we typically see for this time of year. Usually we're about mid 80% as far as the percentage of the lakes being ice covered for this time of year. We do have a soil moisture anomaly map, again, for the more northern climates with frozen soils. This can be deceiving because there is some moisture stored as snow and frost in those soils as well due to the frost depth for this time of year. But I did highlight in the red circle a lot of that lower Mississippi to Ohio River Basin where we are seeing that dryness and the soils associated with some of those deficits that we've seen just over the last 90 days or so, from northeast Arkansas to southwest Kentucky and western Tennessee. But again, as we get closer to spring and we get an idea of just what is happening with those soils, like I said, most of the state climatologists I heard from were not too concerned with the lack of moisture in the soils. More were concerned with some of the damage to some crops such as alfalfa or winter wheat that are being damaged by lack of snow cover and some of the cold temperatures, especially in areas of Wisconsin and Minnesota. I've heard that from those folks up there. So here is today's U.S. Drought Monitor. We can see the drought out in the west and also the southern plains maintaining the longevity of both locations. We do see quite a bit of the Dakotas and Minnesota into parts of Wisconsin, Nebraska, Kansas, and northwest Iowa as abnormally dry. Again, talking about really the last 90 days or so with some moderate drought in the Dakotas and Minnesota. We did introduce some moderate and also some severe drought in portions of Kentucky, and some abnormally dry conditions into Ohio. Again, we noticed this on not only the hydrological indicators, but also some of the precipitation indicators of the last 90 days or so in these regions. Looking at some of the percentiles, currently we have 32% of the U.S. in drought. That was compared to 29% last week. Start of the water year, we were at 30.57%, and a year ago we were at 35.73%. So for the entire U.S. as a whole, we don't see those numbers changing a whole lot, but we do see some of the regions being changing as some areas improve and some areas degrade. That starts to make the numbers more regional versus looking at the contiguous U.S. as a whole. And as of the U.S. Drought Monitor released today with the cutoff period of the 17th, 73.5 million people in the U.S. are being impacted by drought currently. So looking at the region as a whole, currently we have just over 11% of the region in drought, and we can see that that's really isolated into parts of Kentucky, the Dakotas, and then Kansas, Colorado, and Wyoming. A lot of the area is not even designated on the drought monitor, which is quite nice, 63%, a little bit over. And so really we have not talked a lot about dryness in the region outside of some pockets that are showing up on the map, and then some of the longer-term drought in southeast Colorado and western Kansas, and then some of the snow drought associated with conditions in western Colorado and into Wyoming. The Missouri watershed as a whole, we only see 2% of this region in drought right now, and a year ago we were at about 16%. So again, we have seen wetter conditions in the last year and drought not being too much of a concern in the Missouri Basin. The Ohio watershed, 12% in drought right now. A year ago there was hardly any, so there has been some developing dryness. If you think about what El Nino means, and an area of the country that typically gets drier during El Nino, this is a signal that would have been expected, so this is not too unusual even with the weak El Nino conditions that we have seen. Upper Mississippi, again, only about 1.5% in drought. A year ago, we had a little over 36% in drought, so quite a bit of difference in this region compared to where we were a year ago on the U.S. Drought Monitor. The 1 month change, so this has been from about the last call to present. We can see that that dryness in western Colorado and eastern Utah and southern Wyoming coming onto the map here in the last month, as well as some changes in Kentucky and the upper Midwest, as well as some improvements in south central Nebraska to northeast Kansas and into western Missouri, associated with some of the wet events that we had at the beginning of February. So we'll jump into the outlooks, and first thing we'll look at is the 7-day precipitation forecast, the 8 to 14-day outlook. Then we'll go into some of the monthly and seasonal. Instead of the winter outlook, which I did not change my slide, that should be the spring outlook, as well as the seasonal drought outlooks. So looking at conditions over the next 7 days, and where we're expecting to see the most precipitation, you can see that two different areas. The first one out in Colorado and out into western Kansas, a fairly good snowstorm is going to be developing there in the central Rockies and coming out onto the southern plains here over the next couple days. Some of those same areas of Kentucky and Tennessee that picked up quite a bit of wet snow this week are looking to be impacted as well with this next system. Again, storm track will play a big part in this, and you may see the heaviest precipitation region shift, but it's been fairly consistent over the last couple runs of where the most precipitation is expected. again, dry out in the western U.S., but the central to northern Rockies, I talked about making up some of those deficits in basins such as the Platte, and this may be a great opportunity to see those numbers here change at the end of February, and when we see those forecasts come out at the beginning of March again, they may be quite different. So again, these late winter, early spring storms tend to be a little wetter than those earlier in the winter as there's more moisture being fed up into them. So we definitely do have opportunities to improve upon that snowpack in Montana, Wyoming, Colorado, and even some of the precipitation out onto the plains in Midwestern states. So the 8 to 14-day outlook, the temperature on the lower left, the precipitation probabilities on the lower right. We can see that pattern that we have had for the good part of the last 3 to 4 months of below normal temperatures in the east and that transitioning to warmer temperatures in the west, it looks to stay in place as the best chances of below normal temperatures are over the Midwest and Great Lakes and into the Northeast. And we also continue to see that warmth, the best probabilities of above normal temperatures out in the western U.S. Looking at the precipitation, it looks like there's a below normal signal over the Great Lakes and the upper Midwest, and we have a couple pockets of the potential for above normal precipitation being better than average over the western third of the country as well as the southeastern part of the country. And I briefly touched on ENSO a little bit here, and this is the latest numbers, the mid-February plume of the different models that are looking at the projections from CPC and IRI. And as we go into the observed January, about a half degree above normal, and then the models really start to diverge. You see some of them with a warming trend, some with a cooling trend. The yellow line is the consensus of the ensemble of all these models, and that doesn't necessarily even get up to that 1 degree above normal point, and that's by summer. As we move forward, also we need to remember that the analogs associated with El Nino development are strongest in the winter months and not the summer months. And just by looking at the divergence of these models, there is a tendency still showing towards El Nino intensifying or developing further during this time, but again, the confidence is as you can see on this here, the confidence actually declines as we move forward to less than 50% confidence during that time, and we have more confidence of neutral conditions during the spring and into early summer months as well. So,
Brian?
Yeah.
Can you just go back one slide and just say really quickly that as long as it's above the zero line, that tends to be showing that the ocean is behaving a little more on the El Nino side. Once it slips below the zero line, it's going to start behaving more like a La Nina. It could potentially behave more like a La Nina event, especially if it reaches that 0.5 magic line either side of zero. So I know that's a little complex, but I wanted to make sure that people understood that. Thank you. Sorry about that.
No, I think that's a good point to make, that even though we're not seeing a strong signal, it is still more El Nino-ish, if I can use that scientific term, than La Nina-ish on the outlook. So I know that is very simplified in looking at that, but you are right, Doug, that we are still hovering at or above that 0.5 degree Celsius line, which would indicate the ocean's acting more in an El Nino capacity versus a neutral or La Nina situation. And we talked about the probabilities here. I will pass that by. And so the monthly and seasonal outlooks, so again, these are probabilities of being above, below, or equal chances of normal. And you can see for March we have, again, temperatures on the left and precipitations on the right, that probabilities of below normal temperatures seem to be highest again along the Great Lakes and into the Northeast, and some of that into the point that much of the Midwest is showing that higher than normal probability of below normal temperatures. as we've seen for pretty much the last 2 years, all the way from Alaska and the western part of the U.S., west of the Continental Divide, those above normal probabilities of above normal temperatures continue in March, and that does not bode well for accumulating snowpack out there or the long-term drought situation out there. Much of the central and northern plains, even into the northern Rockies and southern plains and portions of the southern Midwest, we see equal chances, so really not a signal one way or the other as far as temperatures in March. And then as we look at precipitation in March, we start seeing this equal chances dominating almost every location that we're covering here in the call. We do see some pockets of above normal probabilities in the southeast and the Four Corners. And then we look at the March, April, and May outlooks. Again, the temperature probabilities are well above normal for the western part of the U.S. across the Continental Divide, equal chances through almost all the plains and Midwestern locations for temperatures, and maybe a little cooler to the south, we'll see. Precipitation, that signal that showed up in March gets amplified a little bit more in March, April, and May, where we're seeing this through much of the Rocky Mountains and southern plains where there's a pretty good probability of above normal precipitation during this time. Equal chances still is dominating much of the country during this time. As we go into the summer outlook, and this is for June, July, and August, we see temperatures, again, it's almost like a broken record over the western U.S. that the above normal probabilities, above normal chances of above normal temperatures are going to maintain itself. And we also see a similar pattern over the east coast of the U.S. Bookended by that is equal chances through much of the central part of the country. And then as we go into the summer, again, this is June, July, August, we continue to see this pocket around the Four Corners of above normal chances of above normal precipitation during this time, and it's been showing up pretty consistently through runs, so we'll see how that development is moving forward. But again, equal chances for precipitation being above or below normal through much of the region in June, July, and August. Seasonal drought outlook was updated today as well. Pretty much the quickest way to interpret this product is anything that is in brown, drought is going to persist or intensify. If it is in yellow, we're going to see drought development likely in those regions. If we see green, we see drought completely removed. If we see gray, that's where some improvement, but drought will likely remain. So if we look at the central plains and Midwest, it looks like some of this dryness that we've been seeing through Kentucky, we're going to see that improve, not only with the storm this week, but also with the anticipated storm coming through towards the weekend here. Some of that dryness in the upper Midwest and the Dakotas and Minnesota, Wisconsin, maybe going to see some of that develop into more drought by the end of May. Again, most of the consensus I've heard through that region is, A, we're happy it's not going to be flooding up here this year. We may actually get in some agricultural work sooner. And B, right now there's not too much of a concern about what moisture is available in the soils out there. The west and southwest, we're going to see much of that drought maintain itself. We may see some of the elimination in Kansas and even some improvements in that region, and especially in southeast Colorado, western Kansas. And so that would definitely help on some of the longer-term drought conditions that we've seen through that area. So in summary, snow in the region. Most areas are seeing below normal snow this season. A couple different things associated with that. Not only will the soils warm up more quickly this spring if we continue to see that pattern, but also they are being exposed to some of the colder temperatures. So the drawback on the agricultural side is if you do have winter wheat or you do have some alfalfa, some of these extreme temperatures to those exposed plants could be hurting or damaging those crops. So we'll have to see what happens moving forward. Temperatures below normal in the eastern portion of the region and well above normal in the west, and it looks like, according to the outlooks that those types of patterns are going to continue at least through the spring and those above normal temperatures in the west even into the summer. Forecast. No strong indication of temperature or precipitation trends through the summer. We again saw mostly equal chances through the plains and Midwest through that time. In drought, I've already talked about this, possible development in the upper Midwest through the spring and some improvement on the lower Mississippi and Ohio River basins during that time. Further information can be found on this slide, a lot of good points of contact on where to get this presentation as well as others. And I also wanted to put up all those that are involved with this process of getting these out. There's some contact folks that would be glad to answer your question or direct you to the correct parties to answer your question if you have one. Anything related to what I presented today, I'll take questions on that now.
Thank you, Brian. We will now open up the question and answer period. Please use *6 to unmute your line before asking your question. And then when you are finished speaking, please use *6 to mute your line again. Just to let you know, our panelists today that are also on the call with Brian are Dennis Toddy of South Dakota State University, Jim Angel at the University of Illinois in Champaign-Urbana, and Kevin Lau from the Missouri Basin River Forecast Center with the National Weather Service. So go ahead and we'll go with our first question.
Hey, Brian, this is Diane Manklager.
Hi, Diane.
Hey, I got a question for you. It happens to do with the drought maps that are coming out and that strange little hook that kind of goes around central South Dakota around Cheyenne River and Standing Rock. There, go back one. You can see it there. There's a hook right in the center.
Yes.
I was just wondering, is that because of information, or is it just following reservation boundaries?
Brian, this is Dennis. I'll take it.
Yeah, I was going to suggest that.
There you go.
Diane, if you have additional information, please let us know. The basis of this was drawn combined with some local input and station data. The area in like Pennington, Hawken, Jackson County, that area was quite dry, and extending up into Perkins County has been quite dry during the winter. There's also a little bit that extends over to the east to connect to the main part of it. If you look at precipitation data for up over Standing Rock and those counties, the deficits are not as large, and there were local reports getting to the National Weather Service in Rapid City indicating that there was still water around there, so it wasn't viewed as much of an issue. If there are other reports, we'd like to hear them. We can take those into consideration and pass those on to the drought monitor officer.
Okay, I'll talk with our fire crews and see if we can get some information out to you guys.
Sure. It was not drawn to avoid the reservation. It was based on the data we had when we were giving recommendations.
Okay.
Hey, Brian, this is Bryce Anderson from DTN.
Hi, Bryce.
Hello. Hey, good to hear you. Good job today. And regarding that upper Midwest dryness, is that a real big issue that you think is going to hang around all the way through spring to where it truly becomes a point of concern during farther on into the growing season?
The feedback that I've received, and I've heard from Dennis in South Dakota, I've heard from Adnan at the State Climate Office in North Dakota, and I've heard from Greg Spoden in Minnesota as well in the State Climate Office. And the consensus has been that they don't feel that this dryness is going to be a concern, mainly because of the snow that is sitting on top of those soils right now, and the scope of the dryness has been short-term during a drier part of the year. They agree that there may be some localized pockets that may be drier, and that's why we haven't really been big on expanding drought in that region up to this point, mainly because abnormally dry does a good job of identifying the last 90 to 120 days that has been below normal, but really no impacts, and that has been the consensus through a lot of that region, that there is still soil moisture available down below, and once we hit spring and we start thawing any of the snow that is on top, it's probably going to be a quicker start to the growing season for some of those folks versus some of the wetness they battled in the last couple of years.
Well, I've had comments from a friend of mine around Jamestown, North Dakota, and he's not worried about a dry winter. I know that because he's lost ground the last couple of years when it was so wet.
Yeah, and I think that has been the consensus, and why you're not seeing more moderate drought in those areas. I think the areas that we do have moderate drought shown in Minnesota, North Dakota, and South Dakota are mainly those areas that have been the driest of the dry over the last 90 to 120 days. If we were going by strictly indicators alone, we could have defended having more moderate drought up in those regions, but with the lack of impacts and the time of year, it just doesn't make sense. So as we go forward, I would say from what I've heard from the experts in those states, we're not too concerned about it right now.
Okay, thank you.
Yes. Sounded like someone was trying to ask a question and then they went away, so you may want to try again if you were trying.
Just a reminder, it's *6 to unmute your line.
Brian, this is Nancy Garter. Can you hear me?
Yes, Nancy. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you. Thank you for the call. Hey, going back to that wet area in the Southwest coming up that persisted through several of the outlook periods. Could you what again was kind of the source for that moisture? And
as far as the
weather systems coming together that would make it likely to happen.
Well, again, one thing to remember is these are just again, probabilities of seeing above normal, below normal, or equal chances of precipitation. So with that above normal probability signal, it's just showing that through the different time frames that we've looked at, and it's showing up in March, April, May, and then even into the summer periods, that it looks like there is a greater probability of seeing precipitation through this region. And what that is going to be associated with as we get into the summer months that go June, July, and August, you may start thinking more of the monsoonal precipitation. But through the rest of the spring and into the early summer, what we would be looking at is a more active weather pattern, meaning storm tracks are looking to be impacting that region more consistently than other areas, and that's why that signal is above. That's probably the most simplistic way of showing it, is just more of a favorable storm track with moisture being brought into that region.
Okay, thanks. And then I guess there's always an outside chance it could lead a little bit further northeast toward the Panhandle in Nebraska, or?
Well, yeah, and I think that's the best thing to remember when you look at any of these outlooks from the Climate Prediction Center. When they do their updates, I tend to tell people, look at the pattern over the last several runs, the last several releases, because what you will see are these patterns establishing themselves. If you see something come and go month to month, I'm going to have a little less faith in what is actually going on, or what the models are showing. But if you see something that's consistent, like the temperatures over the west, we've seen that very consistently over the last year, and it has been a remnant of the climate in the region over the last 18 months or so. And so temperature, again, is different than precipitation, but if you see those precipitation signals time and again, run to run, you have a little more faith in not only where they're going to set up, but what degree of probability, again, is it going to be higher or lower associated with them.
and I think you've kind of answered this, but people around here are talking about our lack of snow, and is there any reason for people to be distressed going forward or worried about whether that bodes poorly going forward in terms of lack of moisture, that kind of thing?
Not necessarily. With the winter being as dry as it is, and I can go back to some of the maps I showed earlier as far as the precipitation conditions go. And when you start looking at the winter precipitation climatologically, it is such a small part of the total or annual precipitation for a region that you can even see that over the last 90 days here, some of those areas that are well above normal in western Nebraska and Wyoming that are 150 to 200% of normal, that it's only equating to maybe an inch to an inch and a half above normal during that time. And we know as we go into spring and summer, our climatological values, our monthly totals, definitely increase. So having a dry winter compared to a dry spring or summer are completely different as far as their impact. And if we do have a dry time of year, really the exposure of some of the crops that are dormant at this time of year is probably one of the biggest dangers. Now as we get into the mountains, it means a lot more as far as water supply going into the various basins. But on the plains in the Midwest, really not a dry winter is not going to really impact what happens moving forward unless we continue into a dry spring, dry summer. Then those deficits just start mounting.
No, thank you very much.
So Brian's really getting at the point of saying these are all indicators, and they're not really predictions so much. It's the only predictions that we have are the Climate Prediction Center's sort of predictions, which may be saying it's equal chances of everything, right? But that said, remember back in 2012 we had a phenomenally warm winter and spring, actually. And that did turn into something else. Now, I'm not saying, we haven't had that. We've had plenty of cold, just a lack of snow, and actually down here in Missouri, we've had a couple rain bouts that were pretty large. So I don't know if there's any easy way to equate snow to upcoming predictions, to be honest.
Thanks, Doug.
Do we have any more questions?
Hi, this is Benjamin Diamond, and I have a question about the drought monitor.
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, for the Texas region, I see it was downgraded this week. And I was
For which region? I heard you cut out right there. For which region?
The Texas.
Okay.
Texas region, drought was downgraded there, and I was wondering what led to that downgrade.
That's a good question. I didn't follow the discussions on the drought map this week. I can put you in touch with the author for this week, Richard Heim, and he can answer the specifics on exactly why he made the changes, or I could also put you in touch with the state climatologist down in Texas to see the reasoning. The state climatologist in Texas leads a group with a weekly call that they cover the entire state in about 20 minutes, and they go over all the most recent and longer-term indicators as well. So I apologize, I can't answer the specifics to why it was downgraded, but I can dig into it more if you'd like to contact me offline.
Okay.
I'll put my contact information back up there for you.
Any last-minute questions? Well, thank you for joining us today for the monthly Central U.S. Climate Outlook. We would like to extend an invitation to you to join us on our next webinar on March 19th. Until then, for Brian and all our panelists, have a good day.